And we're recording live here.
Guys, we are so stoked today. We got a couple of legends in the building. Let's start with our first guy, award-winning documentary filmmaker, been to more countries and seen more things than you can imagine in your wildest dreams. We got Chip Duncan, our brother, our friend, for the third time. We are so stoked, alongside his good friend, Dan White, founder, come on, of the Geotrac Foundation, an NGO focused on expanding the worldviews of young people through travel and culture. Guys, they just came back to the States from the Ukraine. That's what we're going to talk about today. Without further ado, we are so stoked to have you guys. Thanks so much for coming on the show. How are we doing today?
Doing great, but Dan, you got to answer that question.
Well, yeah, doing great. And this is good fun. I've not done this before.
Wait.
No, we're really excited to have you on, and Dan and Chip, and we've been on some. Actually, Devin's been on more adventures with Chip than I have. I think Dev, you were down in Peru with Chip's many years ago when you guys were doing some filming down there, and then we did an African trip. Chip, we did an African trip,
baby.
African Chip. Through Kenya and Ethiopia, and we did an overland trip through Ethiopia, and absolutely incredible. And the stories and the eyewitness events that Chip has witnessed throughout his life is just absolutely outstanding. You could sit and listen for your whole life and listen to his stories, and
that's right.
Incredible. So but first, what we do on our show here is we do something called Two Truths and a Lie, and we've already had Chip on a couple of times, so now we're going to hit Dan up. So, okay, Dev, you're ready. We've got two truths and a lie here. One of them is a truth. The others are a lie. They could all be lies. We don't know, possibly, right? But we have to guess which is the lie. So, are you ready?
Well, yeah, I'm going to give you the one I've given my grandchildren, and they're still debating. You'll notice I'm missing a digit here. And so there's 3 stories about how that happened. The first story is because I go to India quite often, that I got a little cheeky with a tiger and poked him in the eye, and he did a chomp on my finger. The second one is that as a young child, my father told me not to climb on the farm tractor. I did it anyway, and it was a farm accident. And the third one, which most of my nephews believe, is I went to Catholic school, and it was very, very strict school. And the penalty for lying was the nuns cut off one knuckle, and I lied twice.
Geez.
Oh God!
I don't know why I'm laughing at that, but
because it's funny.
You have to have gone to Catholic school to find that.
This is like The Sopranos.
I'm
the
going
Sopranos Catholic school. Dev, I don't. Dev, what do you think is
Because it's funny.
So we're gonna guess the truth or the lie. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a good one.
So which is the one that you think that was the real?
I like them all. I like the poking the tiger in the eye on the Catholic school. I'm gonna go with the farm accident is the truth. And the other 2 are the lies, but we'll see where I stand.
Yeah.
Nige, what do you think here?
Yeah, I'm gonna go with the Catholic school, because they're digging up all sorts of stuff about these crazy Catholic schools these days, and that could be something. Yeah. All right, hit us up, Dan.
It's the tractor.
It's
the tractor.
Yeah, I was 4 years old at a family reunion, and Dad told me don't go climb on that farm equipment. Well, I did. I took a fall, and the best part was I went running up to my mother with my bleeding hand. She took one look at me and passed out.
Oh,
big help you were, Mom.
Oh no. Oh,
but I have had so much fun with this finger. Once again, because I went to Catholic school. My first day in class with a new nun, I would do this.
That's awesome.
Oh gosh. Wow. Okay. That's crazy.
For people who are only listening, you can't imagine that gesture.
Yeah.
Oh. I didn't think about that. Yeah.
That's right. Oh boy.
Well,
Okay, so actually today we're just gonna switch gears a little bit here, onto a little bit more of a serious note, I guess. Is that today we're gonna focus on, the impacts of war and how horrific a war is. And both these gentlemen have just recently come back from Ukraine. And your first visit, this is your second visit there, right? Is that right?
Correct.
Yes,
It's your second visit. And your first visit together was in September of 2022. Is that right?
that's correct.
Yeah. And then during this visit, you focused, your focus was on refugees and IDPs, which is internally displaced people. Is that internationally
Yeah.
displaced people? I get internally.
Internally displaced people.
Internally. Oh,
Yeah.
it's internally.
right.
It is
Yeah,
internally
refugees when they go
displaced.
across the boundary
Yeah.
into another country.
Okay.
And if you stay in your own country, you're an IDP.
If you stay in your country in IDP, so you're displaced inside.
Internally displaced people.
Okay,
So
that's something I never knew.
The
Mhm.
distinction, the word IDP or the phrase IDP is getting a lot more play in the last few years because the distinction between the two is significant for
Sure.
all kinds of reasons.
Right.
And it plays out differently in different parts of the world. It also plays out differently in some ways based on the socioeconomic status of the country. So
Right.
one thing I've noticed in Ukraine as an example is the people who have left the country in some cases are more affluent or have greater resources to be able to to take up housing in a place like Poland or Romania or Germany or Italy, but also because in some cases once you've left the country you may be eligible for stipends from another organization like the United Nations or the European Union. So, and once you've left the country, obviously you're no longer under the protection of the government if that's, in any way a critical issue. And the IDPs in many cases do not have a choice. So a lot of the people that Dan is working with and that I've worked with, are people who have struggled with some kind of disability prior to the conflict and don't have the ability to leave the country even if they wanted to. So if you were prior to this war starting in February of 2022, if you were say in a wheelchair or had a serious mental illness or some kind of developmental disability, the odds of you being able to get out are significantly greater. That it's just so much more difficult to leave. So that puts a greater impact on the society, in this case, the government of Ukraine and individual municipalities to help facilitate their care. Because the one thing both of them have in common is they no longer have a home. And overnight, like literally overnight, much like an earthquake or a hurricane, overnight they have lost their house, their pets, their livelihood, their car in some cases, whatever they had is gone. And so that's the unifying factor between the two.
Wow.
And you almost shouldn't use the word refugee without putting an adjective in front of it. You almost always should. So these folks are war refugees. There's people who are climate refugees. There are people who are fleeing religious persecution. I was just in the UK in Glasgow with a bunch of high school kids doing a study abroad, working with refugees there. And they heard from Iranians who are fleeing religious persecution, Syrians who are fleeing war and torture. They heard from a Rohingya fleeing genocide. We stereotype refugees, and we just think it's especially we in this hemisphere, we view refugees mostly as economic refugees. And that's certainly not the case in Ukraine.
Wow. Yeah. And then so what made you two decide to go into Ukraine? I mean, it's dodgy, and how do you even get in? You just walk across the border. I know you went in through Poland. So what you two got together and said, we're going to go to Ukraine to do, what were you going to do? Like, what was your?
We're part of a larger group organized by a great leader named Dan Poles out of Alexandria, Virginia. And Dan essentially pulls together like-minded people who are willing and able and volunteer to go into different parts of the world, oftentimes crisis zones, to look at how can we use our skills and our networks and our expertise to help improve the situation for those that are in those conflicts. So he works a lot in Kurdistan, for example, and in Syria and in different parts of the world that are crisis zones. That's Dan White and I met through Dan Poles on our first trip in September. We're now planning our third trip for this fall to Ukraine. We'll go back. Dan White can answer the question very differently from his background, but in my case, I'm a documentary filmmaker and a still photographer. So I'm primarily interested in learning the stories for myself in conflict zones. So it's Afghanistan, Darfur, different places I've been, but also in using the media that I'm able to create to help facilitate fundraising or in some way promote change that's positive. But Dan, your story is a lot different than mine.
Yeah, in fact, it stems from the program I just finished with the study abroad with the high school kids. As we in the Geotrac Foundation were trying to put that program together about a year or so ago, I was referred to Dan Poles, or as I call him, Young Dan. I'm Old Dan, and to help me with curriculum, speakers, and so on. And he did indeed do that. But then he said, I'm putting together a group to go to Ukraine. And he said, if you really want to dive into the world of refugees, you should come with us. So that's how I got involved.
Okay, wow.
And to be clear, on our September visit, we landed in Budapest and we drove to border areas in Hungary and Romania, then into Ukraine, then back to Moldova. So we did document refugee situations in Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine, or excuse me, and Hungary. But then in Ukraine, we visited the city of Vinnytsia on our first visit. Our recent trip in May, we went through Poland and visited Lviv, Kyiv, Zhytomyr, and Chernihiv, as well as Vinnytsia. So the two trips were quite different. The most recent one was 100% Ukraine.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And back to your question about getting across the border. If you have a U.S. passport, you can get across the border. Now, it may take you a day and a half waiting in line. We're very fortunate, is one of our group is Sandor Coles, who's the executive director of the CARPATHIAN Foundation. That's an NGO in the area. And Sandor has many connections throughout the area and in Ukraine. And he did a lot of the logistics, including getting us the letters we needed to skip the lines at the border.
Right. So you got in, and then I guess somebody was waiting for you on the other side of the border and picked you up and took you to wherever you were going to go. Is that correct? Or
well, we had a van, and a driver,
and you just drove. You just drove right through.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow. So
the amazing thing about our journeys is, if you look at Ukraine today, 100% of Ukraine has been dramatically impacted by the war.
Yeah.
But it's really only the east and southeast that have, and the north initially, but more recently the east and the southeast that are part of the ongoing fighting. So the front is a long ways away from the Polish border, for example.
Right.
So it's a very odd kind of dynamic, because you can drive on nice roads and stay in nice hotels in parts of Ukraine, and then in other parts, you're taking your life into your hands just by being in that location. But it's also under attack. So at any point in time, when Dan and I experienced this, we were in a traffic jam in Kyiv in our car, and next to us are people at a bus stop and pedestrians on a sidewalk, and it's the middle of the day, and the air raid sirens are going off because there are missiles coming. But in a practical sense, there's really nothing you can do about it. You can't go to a shelter at that point, because you'd be creating an even worse traffic jam. So it's an unusual dynamic. But the West, for example, is has the burden of being the entry point for the supply chain, but also enormous challenges in the medical side, where injured civilians or soldiers from the East have been moved, especially those with longer term challenges, have been moved to the center in the western part of the country. So say a children's hospital in Lviv is double its capacity right now, or triple its capacity, because and so I was in a surgical bay in one of the hospitals where there's two very life-threatening surgeries happening in the surgical room at the same time, because they don't have enough space. I mean, it's overwhelming.
And another dynamic is the movement of peoples has really upset the natural balance in some of these communities. So in Chernihiv, there's out of, I don't know, 400,000 people, there's probably 150,000 less than normal. And that affects everything in that city, from the way their buses run to the restaurants, having customers, et cetera, et cetera. And then you go to Lviv and they've got 200,000 more people than what they had before the war. So it affects, employers being able to find help. There's a lot of dynamics there. And in addition to war casualties, just the normal use of the healthcare system in a city like Lviv is going to increase proportionate to the number of people there and put it under stress.
Right. And so when you were there, like when you were in Kyiv, I think that probably would have been the time where the Russians, just started attacking Kyiv, which it wasn't being attacked. And then suddenly, all of a sudden, they're the drone attacks in the night and all that, which we saw. And
that's
terrifying.
Literally exactly the week we were there. So the first night when we were in Zhytomyr, the Russians launched more than 50 missiles that night and drones. And the vast majority were shot down by the defense forces, but the one that got through actually landed fairly close to our hotel in Zhytomyr. And so in the middle of the night, the hotel's shaking, the windows are shaking, and it's literally a wake-up call to the fact that you're in a war zone. But Dan and I were in south of Chernihiv in the middle of the day, and I was filming the remains of a shopping center. So kind of like a 1 block long, 2-story shopping center that had been destroyed by a missile. And while I was taking a picture of that, you could hear missiles literally crossing the countryside that came out of Belarus on their way to Kyiv. And at first, at least I thought they were low-flying jets, and they were actually missiles in the middle of the day. Those happened to be shot down, but they're whizzing past a few hundred feet off the ground. And the good news was, I said to my colleagues, well, they've already hit this shopping center, so I think we're safe.
Yeah, right.
But it's a very weird, eerie, and overused word, surreal experience to have that happening around you.
Yeah,
it is indeed. And I think most of the public has a stereotypical image of Ukraine that's bombed out buildings and utter devastation, and the vast majority of the country is not like that. So even when we were there and the stepped up campaign against Kyiv started, Kyiv is a city of 4 or 5 million people. And if 30 missiles are shot at it and 28 of them are shot down and 2 land, as tragic as that can be, most of the people in that city will see no evidence of it, nor will you see any evidence of it. When we crossed the border into Ukraine, the first thing I saw were 2 boys, maybe 12-year-olds, on their bicycles with fishing poles. Couldn't have been a more normal sight. And the vast majority of the country exists like that, with the abnormality being the constant fear, the dislocation, some cities being almost vacant, other cities being really overcrowded.
The other thing, Devin and Nigel, that's interesting for me is, as you know, I've worked in Afghanistan and Sudan and Ethiopia and different places, and the one of the big differences for me in Ukraine is it was a predominantly white and relatively affluent country before the war. So when you look at it from a cultural perspective or an ethnic perspective or even a religious perspective, predominantly Christian. And so it has the perception of it by a Western media or a Western mind is different than you might experience, for example, in Myanmar, where Dan White was mentioning the Rohingya.
Yeah, the
I'm
Rohingyas.
sure
Yeah.
it's a very different kind of environment. The climate is very different in a lot of the places I've documented, where you're more in equatorial zones, and the climate crisis is having a greater impact. Where in Ukraine, the roads are nice, electrical system. Unless they've bombed a substation, the electrical system is working, the plumbing is working. A lot of these are things that are not even associated with the areas of Ethiopia, for example, that when we drove through northern Ethiopia, there is no, there is no electricity. So, it's how the nation is perceived by the West, I think, is very different than some of the other parts of the world, because a lot's going on in Sudan right now, but it's not on the news.
Yeah. And I guess that's why, us in the West here, we're all like, surprised that, why did the Russians attack Ukraine? Like, why did they go into Ukraine? I mean, I remember an interview with the British ambassador, the British ambassador to the United States or something, before they invaded. He said, there's absolutely no way. There's absolutely no way that the Russians are going to go into Ukraine. The next week they went in.
Right.
And so why are we all surprised? I know this has been festeringly going on for 70, 80, probably 100 years, maybe not about 100 years, but so what's your scoop on that? Why are we all surprised about
I'll let Dan take that one.
This event here.
Yeah, some are surprised, some are not. I'm not surprised.
Right,
I'm
right.
a bit of a student of geopolitics.
Yeah, that's why I've been reading a lot recently now, and I'm like, okay, now I understand. I was reading a book called Prisoners of Geography, fantastic book, and it explains a lot.
Geography does explain it.
Yeah.
Russia has no natural defensive borders.
Yep.
If you can compare the Russian Federation to the U.S., we've got an ocean on two sides and friendlies north and south. There is no natural barriers to invasion, and the Russians have been invaded from the north, the Swedes, from the south, the Turks, the French, the Brits, from the west, Napoleon, Hitler, Germans twice. So they exist in this state of, I don't want to call it paranoia, but of grave concern. And they understand that they need to push a buffer zone out from their heartland. If you look at the map, the distance from the border of Ukraine to Moscow is only a few hundred miles. And we saw Prigozhin and the Wagner group cruise all the way up to almost the front door. So they live in that fear. And the other dynamic here is the Russians are in the later stages of a population collapse. They have not have a replacement birth rate for decades. Life expectancy is actually going backwards. And so they realize that in 20 years, they won't have a large enough pool of young men to man their army. So they need to be on the western side of the Carpathian Mountains. They need to close off the North European gap that both the Germans and the French came through. And they need to do something with those pesky little Baltic states.
Yeah.
And
they
this
also,
is
they
the
also
first
need
step
a
in
warm
it.
water port. Is that right?
Well, yeah, they've got that in St. Petersburg. But once again, the Baltic is not their lake.
No, that's right. Wow. Yeah.
So
incredible.
those are the geopolitical reasons why stepping back and taking a sober look was very foolish of Putin to do this.
Yeah.
He had some, I gather, bad intelligence to think he'd be warmly welcomed.
But he's warmly, I mean, I don't know, but I think he's warmly considered inside Russia. Is that not right? Like the Russian people seem to be really fully behind him and what they're doing and whatever the propaganda wheel that's moving inside Russia. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why does he have a 70-some% approval rating?
Is that right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I mean, as part of the media, I'd ask who's taking the poll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to know when in an autocratic society what the reality is. And one of the lessons of travel for me has been, you can. Like the first time I went to Burma, at the first time I went, it was called Burma. Now it's called Myanmar. But I remember one of the first things that I did when there was no media going in. There was 1995. Nobody showing up in Burma with a camera or even a pencil and a pad of paper. And I tracked down a National Geographic photographer who had been there about a year before I was going, and asking questions about democracy and dictatorship and what can really what are the people really experiencing. And his big thing was, the minute I opened the door for that conversation, I am putting them in jeopardy. So I'm putting the
Right.
person who's willing to speak their mind, they're now in jeopardy, and we don't know who's listening. And on my first visit to Burma, I had a guide assigned by the government everywhere I went, and they were all military. So,
Yes, yes.
they monitored where I pointed my camera, and how far away I was from a bridge or an airport or a train station. And it was such a controlled environment that I only had one or two conversations with real people, and they were wildly opposed to their government. But would they have ever said that beyond a 5-foot radius? Probably not. So who knows? I don't know. Maybe there's Russian analysts who live there that could answer that question better than me. But
yeah, it's
I don't know.
interesting.
Oh,
When we were in, I mean, we were in Myanmar or Burma 7-8 years ago. Devin was there with us, and it was really interesting. Dev, do you remember in the mornings we'd get up and we'd walk out? We were in Mandalay, I think. Walk out in Mandalay on the dirt roads, and you'd see these 50, 60, mostly men, all squat down, and they're all reading these little newspapers. And what it was all the information that was coming in from the outside. It was smuggled in at night, I guess, and from a different country with I don't know who was running the press, the British or whatnot, a British journalist. And these guys were all just looking through all this stuff as fast as they could. Do you remember seeing those guys? Remember those? They were everywhere, Dev.
I do remember that,
yeah.
And being like, what's going on there? And then what's Mr. Han explaining
Mr.
it
Han,
to us, what was going on, outside information, trying to figure out. I mean, it'd be really, really tough, right? If you're getting all your sources just from a piece of paper. I mean, that's how it used to happen, right?
Yes.
Of course,
Well,
tiny
and
little
you
robots.
guys know this from all of us have that experience with Myanmar, and in Russia right now, the foreign media has very little access, and especially after the arrest of the Wall Street Journal reporter. It's I personally, I feel safer in Ukraine than I would in Russia.
Right. Wow.
And the independent sources have pretty much been either closed down or chased out of the country.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess you can explain at least a good part of the approval rating with the fact that the government controls the messaging in the media. And unless we get too pompous, I would ask the question, is it worse that the government controls the message that the media puts out, or if the media voluntarily spouts the government message, which we see a lot in our polarized media in the US?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And then so I was reading some of your information this morning that Dan sent me, and this one really kind of hit me, about the war crimes that you guys, I don't know if you guys saw anything or whatnot, but the people that you were talking to, and there was this headline in your little presentation called "Today We Touch the Face of Satan." And can you just share a little bit about that and the villagers and what that was all about?
Yeah, that was in the village of Yehindi,
Yeah.
just not too far from Chernihiv, where understand that in Europe and Ukraine in particular, the pattern of rural settlements is very different than Canada and the US. Here, our farmers will have a homestead out on their land. And in Ukraine, farmers live in villages and they go out to work their fields. So that makes those villages particularly vulnerable to Russian artillery. And this was one of those kind of villages. And the Russians bombarded it and then sent their tanks and infantry in there. And I think it was like 300 or 400 people were left alive. Some were shot outright because the fellow we were talking to, his name was Ivan, was one of the survivors.
Yeah.
And it was very touching. He was in, I don't know, what would you say, Chip, 65?
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very emotional for him. And he said that anybody wearing camouflage was shot. Anybody who had camouflage in their wardrobes was shot. One fellow who was retired military in his 60s was shot. And the 368 people left were taken to the grade school and imprisoned in a rather small basement in that grade school for 27 days until the Ukrainian forces took over the village again. I'll let Chip share some of his insights, because this was my first time seeing anything like that. And quite frankly, I got more emotional than objective.
Yeah.
I would have to put it in a context of anyone who's aware of some of the war crimes perpetrated by the Germans, by the Nazis, against the Jews. So Auschwitz is the thing that comes to mind. These people were held in captivity, mostly in the dark. The age range was roughly like a 3-week-old newborn to an 85-year-old. And they were kept in the basement of the school. We're talking about maybe 150 feet by 30 feet, divided into separate rooms. One of the rooms that was the most challenging for our group was the plumbing from the school bathroom was right above this room in the basement, and the Russians that overtook the school and held the civilians captive in the basement, they destroyed the plumbing. And so when it was being used, literally human waste would leak down through the ceiling onto the people that were in the basement. They had no food. The couple of times that they were given food or given water, it was bad. The food was, it was largely inedible, and the water would make them sicker than they were before. Several of the people who were there died. It was, they weren't allowed to see daylight. The things that I photographed there, it was largely untouched when we were there. And, it's kind of like you can't make it up. It's a war crime under the Geneva Convention to put civilians in a school and then overtake the school, or to do the same thing with a hospital. Hospitals and schools are off limits. So they were using that as a deterrence to being attacked. Among other things, they had tanks situated around the school, so the big dugouts where the tanks would be were still there. But when they left, when the Ukrainians were finally overtaking this region and the Russians left, they left behind evidence of their own crimes. They didn't make an effort to clean it up in any way or to hide what they did. And so you would find the remains of everything. They've now, the ICC has now found evidence of, journal entries into what they were doing. They've got documentation of some of the different ways that the civilians were tortured. It's all still in place. So when I was there as a photojournalist, I was able to document a lot of it. And it could be as simple as the left behind boot of a Russian soldier, or a footlocker with some supplies in it, or things that were written on the wall by the civilians who were held captive. They literally on the wall, using charcoal or chalk, would write a calendar and mark X's so that they knew what day of the week it was. They didn't even know how time was passing. It was like being in confinement, like solitary confinement, with 368 people all in one basement for a month.
There was not enough room for people to lie down. They had to sleep sitting on their haunches or standing up or whatever.
Leaning against each other.
And there were 17 that died. And the survivors wrote names on the walls as people died. There were 7 on one side of the door, 10 on the other. The 7 on the left side were murdered by the Russians, just outright shot. The other 10 died of, you can call it, natural causes. But 17 of them didn't come out alive.
The good news is, Devin and Nigel, the good news is that a lot of it has been documented by prosecutors in Ukraine and also by the ICC. And so there are countless war crimes that have been committed by the Russians. It's different than any conflict I've seen before, because they're not making an effort to even hide what they're doing. I've photographed 3 hospitals that have been destroyed by Russian artillery or missiles. 3 hospitals that I've photographed. I mean, there's countless more hospitals, in the Donbass region. It's astonishing that they would literally, I mean, you know, drone technology and cruise missile technology today. I could pinpoint the microphone that you're talking through if I wanted to, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So it's not an accident when you hit a school. It's not an accident when you hit a hospital. And, you know, their argument might be, well, you know, there's Ukrainian soldiers hiding in that building. It's just not true. I mean, there's civilians because it might be a bomb shelter, but it's, you know, it's unlike anything I've seen in other conflicts.
You know, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, standing in that basement, listening to Ivan tell the story is worth 1,000 pictures. It's just absolutely incredible to see that, to try to envision it, to smell that place.
Yeah.
And to think that there were 368 people crammed in there, forced to use buckets that were overflowing, forced to relieve yourself in public. These are elderly women that had to do this. It's just horrendous stuff. Now back to the question of why are we surprised? When I was getting ready to take these kids to Scotland and talk to refugees, we had a talk and I put up 4 photographs, and it was 4 photographs of absolutely devastated, bombed out cities. And they all thought it was Ukraine. I said, no, the first one is Grozny, it's Chechnya. When the Russians went in there, you know, their second Chechen war, when Putin came to power. And the second one was Georgia, when the Russians invaded Georgia in 2008. And the third one was Aleppo in Syria. And only the fourth one was Ukraine. But in all cases, they're identical. You carpet bomb, you go after the hospitals and medical clinics and the schools first, you terrorize the population. That's their modus operandi. So we should not be surprised at all that that's the way they're conducting themselves in Ukraine.
It's just, yeah, it's just shocking. And I was reading a little bit of your thing there that you sent over, and then I don't know if there was a comment or something by a Russian soldier, and he just said, "This is war."
Right.
War.
It was very interesting. Ivan's description of the various conversations they had with their captors, you know, pleading to get a window unboarded so the baby could have fresh air, etc. And it was almost as if, you know, the analogy Chip came up with the German concentration camps, you know, that came to mind, that level of cruelty and disregard for human life. These guys were just thugs.
You know, back to your question too about what do the Russian people think, and what kind of support does Putin have within Russia? It is really hard to know. But one of the things that you've seen both with mainstream Russian forces and with the Wagner Group is the idea that you can take prisoners and put them on the front line in exchange for getting out of jail. So like, you know, let's say you've got a 3-year sentence for dealing drugs in Moscow. Okay. Well, guess what? That happens all over the world. And now you're going to get a jail-free card if you go serve 6 months in you know, along what would be Russia's Western Front. Well, guess what? First of all, it's unlikely you're going to survive. And if you do, who said 6 months? Well, that we meant a year, or we meant 2 years.
Yeah.
And the fighting techniques along the Eastern Front, a lot of them are very similar to what we saw in World War I. So, you know, that's literally over 100 years ago when trench warfare was the norm. And these guys are just, you know, just like cannon fodder. I mean, it's
fodder. Yeah.
It's as bad as what they're doing to Ukraine. It's unbelievable that they're also doing it to people from their own country. I mean, it's mind blowing. To do what? I mean, I'd stay in jail.
So if you're not getting any news from the front, that's the thing.
On a strategic front, it makes sense from the Russian point of view. First of all, they don't have to house, feed, and take the expense of these prisoners anymore.
Sure.
But more importantly, the Russians know that the Ukrainians have got to effectuate somewhere around a 7-to-1 ratio of kills, just because there's one heck of a lot more Russians there are Ukrainians. Russia's, you know, Ukraine's about 40 million people. Russia's maybe 3 times that. So by forcing the Ukrainians to kill 7 worthless prisoners, instead of 7 regular army folks, it really upsets that ratio. The Ukrainians don't need to kill 7 prisoners. They're not effective. They need to kill 7-to-1 ratio of regular Russian military.
Okay. Wow. Gosh. So maybe let's switch a little bit here to some of the rehabilitation. So you guys have been going in, and there's the rehab and the medical, and also we'll talk a little bit about Open Hearts, what you're doing there as well. Yeah. So what's going on with rehab of these poor people, and we take it back to the beginning here when we first talking about the people that are inside and not able to get out, the people that are in wheelchairs, and people that so yeah, what's going on with these people? Like what yeah.
Well, the refugee flow from a conflict zone
Yeah.
is a cross section of society.
Yeah.
Whether it be age groups or, if you got, I don't know, 10% of your society is diabetic, then 10% of your refugees going to be diabetic. If you have a certain percentage of people with, I don't know, heart disease, or maybe they're in the middle of their courses of treatment for cancer, chemotherapy, let's say,
Yeah.
all those things are resident in the same proportions in your refugee flow or your IDP flow. And in particular, special needs citizens. And special needs, covers a really broad area, a really broad spectrum. But on the whole, on the average, those are some of the most vulnerable and the most needy of your flow of people fleeing the crisis zone. And they're some of the more difficult ones, both to move and to then find appropriate care for them. It's a very, very difficult thing.
And
So,
this particular facility in Venetia,
yeah.
that Dan has very successfully undertaken some of the ongoing development of this facility. I had as much work as I had done with refugees around the world. I had a lot less experience when it came to IDPs who were disabled. So it was very eye-opening for me to go to this facility in Venetia called Open Hearts, run by a very angelic, older middle-aged woman who Dan will fill you in on her, but she's just doing a marvelous job. But when we went into the facility, the people in each different room who were here for care and communal meals and whatever recreation they're getting is on that one little facility. Every one of them had a different kind of disability. So they were largely people who had come to Venetia from frontline cities that had been destroyed, but their disabilities were not all one thing. And so the caregivers are essentially dealing with everything from autism to heart conditions to amputated legs to a broken neck to you name it, and
Alzheimer's,
people who really were struggling prior to the conflict. And for me, it was very eye-opening. For Dan, he had a lot more experience with disabled populations, but these facilities, the one we're focused on is in Venetia, but they exist around the country. They were there before, maybe are getting larger now for different reasons, but they need physical therapists and they need occupational therapists and they need people who can come in and help, facilitate and also more housing. And Dan can address the specific needs.
Yeah, when we visited them, that facility predated the war. And they provided different kinds of therapies, educational opportunities, and respite care. And that's why they had quite a few dormitory rooms. So if you had a special needs child, you could take your child there for a weekend and get away, or a family vacation, etc. So when the war came, they pivoted away from providing respite care to providing residential services. So all their dorm rooms were filled with people who came from the East. And like Chip said, just there's no two alike. I mean, and that's the way special needs community works. But the other thing they did and continue to do is they're a conduit for getting people to other places, maybe even out of the country, getting to an appropriate care facility in Poland or Czech Republic or something like that. And they just jump through all kinds of hoops. They don't have the proper equipment in many cases. They told stories of putting air mattresses on the bottom of buses for people, etc. So these people have a true heart and are doing truly good things. And one of the things I learned on the first trip when Chip and I were in Romania is if you're going to do something, especially if you're going to donate money, go down the food chain as far as you can reach. Now, I would not discourage somebody from giving money to UNESCO or whatever, or Save the Children. But if you can find a local group providing local care and put your dollars there, then it's really impactful. And so that's what we're doing with Open Hearts. We've collected enough money to build them a stairwell and an elevator to their second floor, so their folks in wheelchairs can get up there. And they have more dorm rooms up there that are better designed for handicapped people, wider doors, that kind of stuff, and more equipment for bathing and bathrooms and whatnot. And so there's a lot of needs like that we're trying to do that kind of stuff for them.
Right. And is this part of your Hope Across Borders? That's what
yes, that's our website. And if I can put in a plug, hopeacrossborders.org. Yeah. Every page has a donate now button. Go in there and click on it.
And click away. And
our next project is to get them a wheelchair capable minivan. Right now they I don't know, they throw the wheelchair in the back of somebody's car and can transport one person at a time. Yeah. And they've got more needs than that.
Yeah, I mean, as I think and I see the news over and over and over again of the the refugees, the IDPs, all moving around Ukraine and moving outside of Ukraine. You see the people that are kind of able and they're walking and they're carrying as much as they can. You don't see the photographs as much as the people that don't have the ability to walk or the ability to look after themselves or whatnot. You don't see that. You see the masses of the other people trying to get across the borders and whatnot. And so I think this is beautiful. It's really I can see it in my mind right now, these people that are kind of stuck and have no other hope. So it's an incredible thing that you guys are doing.
If you it's interesting because Devin, we started off talking about how you professionally work with fire and juggling and different things. That's your profession, right? One of the guys that I've really fallen for, I think he's just an incredible person. His name is Arthur, and Arthur, like you, he's athletic, and he's he could have been a performer with a street performer or a circus or any number of things, because he was a gymnast and he had strength and flexibility. But at age 18, 19, he was injured, and he was on an Olympic track, but he was injured and has been in a wheelchair ever since. But in every way before the war, he was living a normal life. He lived in Bakhmut. He collected coins. He had a dog. He ran for city council. He had a real life. And then overnight, that life changed. And he can tell you stories about how he got even to his wheelchair, or how he got out of Bakhmut and to this facility called Open Hearts. But what's remarkable is he's upbeat and he's positive and he's super strong, and he can do acrobatics in his wheelchair, all of which the first time I met him was counterintuitive, because I'm like, who is this guy? He's so charismatic and dynamic. But then when you dig, you peel back a layer, and his trusted companion before his house was destroyed was his dog. And he's never seen his dog again, doesn't know what happened to the dog. He was an avid coin collector. He loved collecting coins. Well, his coin collection was destroyed. So a lot of the things that we as humans, our friends, the people that we might go to the donut shop with in the morning, or the gym that we work out in, or where the chef at the restaurant we like to go to, all of those things are gone overnight. And when I met him, probably more than anyone else I met, I was so impacted by it because he's such an exciting, charismatic, capable person. But the life he had is a totally different life than the life he has now. I mean, if you can imagine, because you know me, in my little briefcase, I have a little pouch in there where all of the coins from around the world just wind up. And sometimes I empty it out because they get heavy over time, right? But I'm literally, he's telling me about his coin collection, and I'm digging through my bag looking. I'm like, oh, here's a pound, and here's a sole, and here's a dinar or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he was thrilled because he's restarting his coin collection in Venezia. Wow. But it's like it's so hard to imagine that the life you had was gone like that. Like, right. We're sitting here talking, and and in I can't speak for Canada, but in the United States, I have a friend who he lost his house in the hurricane in Florida last fall. Mm-hmm. But it's temporary because the insurance companies and the city and everybody are coming together, and now the government and FEMA and so he was never without a house. He was never without a livelihood. He was never because everything was insured. It's a pain in the ass, but guess what? His life didn't change, and in this case, all of these people, and we're talking about, Dan said around 40, I think it's 44 million people in Ukraine, roughly a third of the population is displaced in some way, either internally or externally. So 30% of Canadians or 30% of Americans, you can imagine the dynamic of that as a government. And, my hat's off to this country for so many reasons, but one is they are unified in providing support for each other. So whatever their differences might have been, I like the left, I like the right, I like this newspaper, I like that, whatever. All of that is gone. And it's the most unified place I've ever experienced, where people are doing whatever they can to volunteer to help each other. And so if there's an upside, that's it.
Chip, let me ask you if you noticed this. As we were driving across Ukraine, particularly that first day, it was 9 hours from Poland to Zotomir. And, I thought I was driving across Iowa, just, farm fields every place. Mm-hmm. And, cell service, places you can stop and get junk food, et cetera, et cetera. But there's two things I didn't see at all. Number one was pickup trucks, no pickup trucks. And number two was litter, not a gum wrapper. And that goes for the cities too. We drove through Kyiv, didn't see one bit of litter. Venezia, no litter.
Yeah, there's
Lviv, no litter. Nobody throws a gum wrapper on the ground there. That shows a great deal of respect for your country.
Yep. Yeah, I've never seen any place like it. It's inspiring and makes me, I mean, I'm excited to go back. I can't wait to go back.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I love like what you were talking about there, Chip, a few minutes ago, this young person and whatnot. And kind of that kind of reflects with what Dan's been doing here with the Geotrac Foundation. I really love what you're doing here with the young people, and you've got this whole thing going with expanding the worldview of young people through cultural and travel. And for me personally, that really resonates with me, because that changed my life. I mean, I didn't do that well in school and whatnot, but I was, booted out, and I was in Venezuela right out of high school next day, and working down kind of in the oil rigs and stuff, and completely changed my life. And my life hasn't changed. All I travel. That's all I've ever done is travel. And I've learned more and respected more people and cultures through travel than anything. And I think that was the biggest gift I've ever had. So what you're doing there with young people and, helping them get out and see the world through their own eyes. And, it's the best thing we could do for humanity, is to have people visit other cultures and have dinner with people in other cultures and have talks, right?
The most frequently asked question amongst these high school kids last week was, why don't we know about this? Why aren't we taught this?
Yeah.
And when we debriefed one day, I asked each one of them, where do you get your news? TikTok, TikTok, TikTok. Every one of them, TikTok.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Dev, as you as a young guy too, being traveling, a lot. I mean, you were similar to me. I mean, you had a hard time in school, and it was rough. But then I saw the change in you instantly as soon as you stepped into some of these like Myanmar and whatnot. It had a huge effect on you. Hey?
Yeah, no, it's a change of perspective. I mean, we get so used to just regular life and just being like comfortable in our environment. But like you guys are saying, the country maybe was divided by politics or whatever, but then the war happens, everyone comes together. It's almost like things need to get so bad or so crazy till you realize like how lucky you are just to have like, we have like running water that you can drink. Like, that's just like mind blowing in itself. I'm safe. I have friends. I can go to the store and cook a hamburger or whatever. But just getting that other perspective and going to every other places in the world just changes everything. Because you're like, this person, it's like or in Mexico when we're building houses for people. I'm like, you're talking to the guy and I can't speak Spanish, but we are communicating. And you get to that point, I'm just like, holy crap, like we're the same. I could have been born here. You could have been born in Canada. But we are the exact same. So it's just, and then to take that home and remember those messages, like be grateful every day.
Yeah.
So, Devin, I got to tell you, because I met you in Peru.
Yeah.
Before I knew Nigel, right? So I went with Devin to Coyarichi, which is a festival of indigenous people that happens between 15 to 18,000 feet up in the Andes every year, full moon, late spring. And one of the things I liked about you immediately was you looked at what many people would consider one of the most foreign environments possible, with religious or spiritual practices that are mind-blowingly different than anything we've seen in our lives before. And you didn't judge it negatively. You embraced it and you were curious about it. And there was no sense of, protecting a racial identity or an ethnic identity or a religious identity. You were like, I want to know what is going on and who are these people and why do you wear that and how did you learn to dance that way? And then I watched you in Ethiopia, and one of the places that we stopped, and Dan, you may not know this, but I've taken people from Mekele to Lalibela across northern Ethiopia, which is where their civil war has been largely destroying things. But we went to the Koram Plateau, and we're standing on a Koram Plateau where the famine happened in the mid 80s. And Devin and his brother are out in this big open field with these Ethiopian kids playing soccer and tumbling and tossing and nosediving. And then you look at the soccer ball, and it's not a soccer ball in any traditional sense. It's basically wadded up fabric sewn together into a ball shape. Yeah. And that's enough to unite around what is the concept of play. Well, we all play the same way. We all are developing our minds the same way. And that's the thing that I don't know why, Dan, I don't know why we're not taught these things in the schools. So when your students last week were, why don't we know this? I don't necessarily know the answer, but I know how important it is.
You know what they asked me?
Yeah.
They said, would you consider taking one of our teachers next year? Yes.
Excellent.
Definitely.
Yeah, very smart on their part.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's always one of those things I've always reflected back on is this, that, why don't we, I mean, and a lot of kids do when they graduate from high school, they go on a bit of a walkabout and they go backpacking around Europe or something. But it's almost one of these things. It's just like, as part of the program, go to a country like Myanmar, Ethiopia for 2 months, 3 months, whatever it is, and volunteer. Just that's it. Simple, very simple. And it would change the world.
If you took a 15-year-old kid from St. Petersburg and put him with a 15-year-old kid in Venezia, exactly. They're both like, oh, wow, I love classic rock. I didn't know you like classic rock. Let's listen to Led Zeppelin,
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's right.
Immediately friends for life, because the rest of it is not what makes us tick. It's like very few people want to go to war, except for some reason, we keep winding up with leaders and autocrats who do. But the average person just is looking for that common denominator of what makes us human.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, it's the leaders with the big egos. I know. I remember there's this movie that Devin and our family watched religiously every time we go to this little surf town called Tofino in Vancouver Island. It was called I think it's Step into Liquid, right?
Yeah.
And it's remember those all those Irish brothers, the Malloy surf. There's
Oh
like
yeah,
three
yeah.
brothers, and they go to Ireland, and this is during when it's an old movie, and they get a bunch of Catholic kids and a bunch of Protestants kids all together, and they teach them how to surf. And it's exactly what you're saying. They're out there, they're helping each other out. Everything kind of goes, doesn't matter if they're Protestant or Catholic, they're all having fun in the surf. And they come in and they're sitting on the beach and they have a fire going and they're sharing their stories. And they're the best of friends within, 2 hours. And yeah, it's just beautiful. So you're so right. Yeah, bring somebody from St. Petersburg into Kyiv or wherever and have a chat with a bunch of kids. Yeah. Yeah, powerful. Really, really powerful stuff. So are there any other little things to wrap up here? I mean, Ukraine now, what do I don't know if you want to predict anything or talk about anything or
I'll say one thing that
yeah.
I watched this brewing, and like the British journalist you mentioned, or the British ambassador you mentioned, I really did not think that Russia was going to do it. I didn't think they would. So I was wrong. I think Dan might have been more prescient on that front. But if you step back and look at the war, 19, 20 months in, I think we're now well over 500 days.
Yeah,
I would say by all measures, Russia has lost, whatever their goals were initially. They're so far removed from achieving anything of value. And if you're looking for just a couple of references to that, I would say one is, if the goal was we don't want NATO on our doorstep, well, just look at Finland and you go, holy shit. I mean, it's like, there's an 850-mile border that was not NATO before that is NATO now.
right.
And it's all predicated on the idea that, we do not want to be invaded. We're here to defend our other countries that are like-minded. Uniting the Ukrainian public the way that it's been united, I don't think they saw that coming. So I would not want to be in Putin's shoes right now. And that's not just, about the day-to-day fighting and the death toll and that sort of thing. It's just he's already lost. He's lost.
Yeah.
I don't know what his goals were, but he didn't achieve them.
Yeah. And yesterday he's down and snuggling up to Africa,
Snuggle away. Yeah.
Snuggle. Yeah, that's right.
See, I'm not surprised because we did little or nothing when he invaded Georgia. We strongly condemn. Well, what's that mean? We did little or nothing when he joined in the Syrian civil war. We did little or nothing use of chemical weapons in Syria. We did little or nothing when the little green men went into the Donbass and into Crimea. So, he's looking at this pattern of behavior. Why would he guess in his wildest imagination it would be such a radical break with that pattern of behavior?
Right.
So that's the surprise. It's the unity of NATO, the West stepping in, doing something substantial for once.
And the last thing I'll mention, Nigel, and you guys have visited East Africa and know it well, but I am really disheartened by the grain deal being reneged upon and what's happening in terms of the food crisis globally. And that's, yes, he's courting African leaders right now, but he's not very successful at it. And if you look at East African leaders, they're not kissing up to this guy, because that what has already been a global food crisis is only going to get worse if they block grain. And so it's insidious. Every time food is used as a weapon, the world just takes more steps backwards. And why he's doing that, it's mind-blowing. But hopefully we'll find a way to get through that blockade. Hopefully we'll find other ways to distribute food through the border countries. Because I'm on, as working regularly in Kenya and Ethiopia, and those places are, they already have a food crisis. It's only going to get worse, and that's true in large parts of the Middle East. So and I think Dan mentioned driving across Ukraine was like driving across Iowa.
Iowa,
It is truly
Yep.
a breadbasket. There's more product, agricultural product there than I've ever seen anywhere. But we don't want it rotting in silos. We want to get that food released and distributed to the world. So
yeah. I mean, even
But
driving.
I would point out that 2 weeks before scuttling the grain deal, the Russians exercised their veto in the UN on the UN food program to the rebel-held areas of Syria. There were 4 crossings where that food could come in. And Russia vetoed the program, saying if you're going to give food to Syria, it has to go through the Assad regime, who will use it as a weapon to starve out the opposition.
Wow. Which we saw not firsthand, but we saw secondhand on the Koran Plateau in Ethiopia where you took us there, Chip, right? Where they used food as a weapon in 1984, and millions of people, whatever, died.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh yeah. And even in the current civil war, same thing.
What's going on now back in Ethiopia? Yeah.
And refugees are used as a weapon. When the initial incursion into Syria, Putin had his hands on the spigot of refugees, and he knew that the refugee flows were causing all kinds of political havoc in Europe. So he could turn it up or turn it down based on what he wanted to achieve.
My gosh. Wow. So maybe we'll wrap up. Wrap up on a positive note. Let's turn it back around. What I'm going to say is that you guys are doing incredible stuff, and so privileged that Devin met Chip many years ago and has taken us on some of these amazing journeys to hear some of your incredible stories. And Dan, what you're doing is incredible stuff too. So any other little fibers you want to throw out before we wrap it up?
I'll mention one thing, which is I'm now working on a book, second in the trilogy. So it'll be the book following Iwasa Village. The new book is I changed horses, and the new book is about Ukraine. I hope to have it out a year from now, and I think it'd be great to end with a plug for Dan's website one more time, so people who are listening or watching might be able to help with a donation that goes, as you said, down the food chain right to Open Hearts. And you want to close with that?
I would. It's hopeacrossborders.org, and all the donations go through the US-Ukraine Foundation and go directly to the Open Hearts organization in Vinnytsia.
Fantastic. And Dev, I guess you could wrap it up on that.
Guys, I mean, just thank you so much for coming on, guys. These are some men who are changing the world, will change the world on getting the real story out, and of course getting their boots on the ground and actually doing the thing, which all of us can just inspire to do. It's just incredible. Of course, Dan White, thank you so much. Chip Duncan, we'll put everything in the link of the description of the video, guys. So hopeacrossborders.org, get on there, donate please, that'd be amazing. And Chip's new book, we're going to be really stoked for that one to come out, man, and we'll have to have you guys back on when there's some new stuff going on. But thank you so much for coming on today. It's just an incredible show, and I learned so much. I just sat here like a sponge and just soaked up a lot of information. So, and I will pass on to my peers, and just thank you guys for coming on. It's really means the world to us.
Yeah, really means a lot, guys.
Keep up the good work on the podcast, you guys.
Exactly.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Nothing without the guests. That's the thing.